point where you and I can't even go to a Washington Redskins game anymore because that team doesn't exist. It rippled out into all aspects of this kind of reevaluation of where we were. Welcome back to the show. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington Bureau Chief of Real Clear Politics, talking now with an old friend, Juan Williams. Juan's a columnist, political columnist, a veteran White House correspondent. He covered the White House with my dad, actually, at the Washington Post back in the day. And he's a commentator on Fox News. He's much in demand because he's one of these guys who actually lets the reporting inform his judgments, not the other way around. And Juan's written a new book, New Prize for These Eyes, The Rise of America's Second Civil Rights Movement. Welcome, Juan. Thanks for doing this.
You know, Carl, I was so taken by your introduction because you knew me when I had some hair.
Well, my hair's thinning too. All right, my friend.
I really appreciate that.
Tell us about the new book. Let's just get right into it.
Sure. So this new book, as you said, New Prize for These Eyes. In some ways, it's an extension of a book I wrote. And again, this speaks to a guy who's losing his hair. 40 years ago, I wrote Eyes on the Prize, America's Civil Rights Years, 1954 to 1965. It was a companion volume to a PBS series that was a big hit. And it told the story of the first civil rights movement, as you heard in the title, 54 to 65. So we're talking Brown decision, ending legal segregation in the public schools, to passage of first the Civil Rights Act in 64, and then, very importantly, the Voting Rights Act in 1965. And maybe most famously in that period, Dr. King came to Washington, our home, and had the March on Washington and did the I Have a Dream speech. Fast forward to 2025, Carl, and the publication of this book, New Prize for These Eyes, and the rise of America's second civil rights movement, is really about a new movement that is taking place and calling people to recognize we're in the midst of making history again, and don't think that it's going to look just like the first movement. In fact, it's built on the first movement, but quite different. Whereas you had the Great March on Washington in 63, after George Floyd's death in Minneapolis, we had thousands of Black Lives Matter marches across the country with millions of people. And not only that, you could have been in Paris, London, Buenos Aires, and you would have been in a Black Lives Matter march. In the 63 case, everybody had to wait for the morning papers to find out what happened. Now we live in an age of viral media. After George Floyd literally wouldn't have been a thing unless there was a young woman with a cell phone that had the camera running and saw the policeman with the knee on the neck and all that. And now you have viral messages, memes, tweets, or X's, however you want to say it. And it drives a conversation about race and arguments about race that I think constitute a second movement.
Well, let me ask you. Let me get in. I want to ask you a couple of questions about that, because as you're talking, I'm thinking, there is this thing rippled out. I covered cops for years, and I remember initially, I thought as it was a mistake to focus what the police were doing, the excess of the police, solely on as a black-white issue, as a black civil rights issue. And my thinking was, and the Washington Post, your old paper, did the great work on this. We thought that between 500 and 600 Americans were killed every year by police. Mm-hmm. Turns out and the Justice Department doesn't require police departments to tell them. There's no national database. The Washington Post actually started doing a database, and it turns out it's like twice as many people as that. And some of them, these notorious cases we know about, are unarmed black men, often, sometimes doing nothing wrong whatsoever. But it turns out a lot of more white people are killed than anybody by police. I thought we have a law enforcement problem. And if we just talk about race, maybe we'll miss the point. But I soon realized this was part of a much larger conversation, to the point where you and I can't even go to a Washington Redskins game anymore because that team doesn't exist. It rippled out into all aspects of this kind of reevaluation of where we were.
I couldn't agree more. Thanks, Carl. This, you really, I think, are touching on something. Race is hard to discuss because it makes people uncomfortable. But it's interesting to me in terms of the backlash to Black Lives Matter. So much of it is based on the idea that, well, blue lives matter, and we need the police. And if you think back to Rodney King back in the 90s and the thin blue line and all the rest, and people tried to undermine Black Lives Matter, right, by pointing to actual violence. And there's a high rate of violence, unfortunately, in many Black neighborhoods, poor people, disproportionately so. And then they would say, well, what about the Black Lives Matter marches? There was some violence there, overwhelmingly nonviolent, but anytime there was violence, oh, then, looting. Remember what Trump said, the looting starts, the shooting starts, and stuff like that. And so it became that kind of thing where you're thinking, oh, is it a matter of lack of respect for police and social order and threats to our businesses, and that's what we need? Or is it the argument coming from Black Lives Matter that police can be brutal, especially in how they handle people that are seen on the street as threatening, walking around in a hoodie, or he's got his pants hanging down, and people say, well, I don't want to have that discussion. It's kind of touchy, you don't want to say the wrong thing. But in fact, that's what's going on. I mean, you think about Black Lives Matter, it starts with Trayvon Martin, the kid who's in the hoodie, who gets shot by the volunteers security guard. And then the police are slow to arrest him. He's cleared by a jury. And then Black Lives Matter is born. That's the start of the Black Lives Matter movement. Um, and I think that Carl Cannon is pretty honest to say, let's have that discussion right at the start of this interview.
So who are the hero? Who are the heroes of this movement, of the second wave? I see this as a sequel to your first book, and you and I know the heroes. They were starting in my childhood with A. Philip Randolph and Martin Luther King, of course, and these other people, Ralph Abernathy, and some white leaders, Hubert Humphrey. We right, we know these people. Who are going to be the heroes? Who are the iconic people who led this movement? Who Americans, who are going to be building statues to 50 years from now?
Yeah, because we're coming up on King birthday holiday, a federal holiday now, as we are speaking. And I must say again, I am so glad that I'm doing this with you, Carl. You really understand this. I don't always appreciate that side of you because I'm thinking politics when I talk to Carl Cannon. But anyway, yes, if you think back to Dr. King, if you think back to Roy Wilkins, John Lewis, the former congressman, was a leader of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, got his head bashed in and marching for voting rights. You say, oh, these are iconic figures. We all know those figures. So who is it that's the equivalent in your second civil rights movement, Juan? And in fact, what I am hesitant to say is there's no equivalency. The people who started Black Lives Matter are like Patrisse Cullors, Alicia Garza, uh, Opal Tometi. They start online in California talking about that Trayvon Martin's life, however you perceive them as threatening, or he was listening to music in his ear and was too loud, it was rap, you didn't like it. That kid's life mattered. Black lives matter. But they're in California. This movement starts on social media. It's diffuse. They don't want a hierarchy. They don't want what they call the patriarchy, Dr. King type male figure leading. And so they are leading basically a movement that has gone viral and gone international, and people are organizing here and there, but there's no consistency to the message other than we don't like police violence against Black people. And the other answer to you, Carl, is we live in the world of politics. It's hard to get away from Barack Obama as a standout figure in this period, but he's not a civil rights activist. He's a politician. And in the book,
I was gonna ask you about Barack Obama, but before I do that, let me remind our listeners and viewers, talking with Juan Williams, a well-known Washington columnist and commentator, and author of New Prize for These Eyes: The Rise of America's Second Civil Rights Movement. I'm Carl Cannon, Washington bureau chief, Real Clear Politics. Thanks for joining us. Juan, I got to say, so Barack Obama came. You and I had a discussion about him last year. he's not a product of the civil rights
No.
movement in that he's not active in it, but he's the
Right.
result of it. He's
Yes.
right. And you know, I would sometimes, I finally gave up on this. I would tell my reporters, I would correct their copy. You can't call him the first black president because his mother was white and and his father was from Africa. So he's actually the perfect African American is the perfect phrase for this guy. But you know, I lost that battle. But Barack Obama comes. He's, you know, remember for early in his term, his first term, he still struggled to define American exceptionalism. He kind of was dismissive of it, like a college professor, like a liberal college professor. Oh, there's Greek exceptionalism. Well, not really, but but by the he first of all he got his sea legs on that. By the end, he talked about that very eloquently. But the other point was he didn't need to talk about it because he was proof of it.
Oh man. You know, so I think I make the case in this book, obviously, that we're in the midst of a second movement that's having as much impact as the first movement, although people don't seem to recognize that. And it starts with Barack Obama, Carl. It starts with his '04 speech at the Democratic Convention when he talks about we're not a black America, white America, gay America, straight America, Asian, Latino. We are the United States of America, he says. And it's very uplifting. And to your point, again, thank you for doing this interview. To your point, he says, my story couldn't have happened in any other country. And talk about American exceptionalism. He is a uplifting, positive, optimistic storyteller about being black in America. Quite a contrast, Carl, because of your political background. I'm going to say this. Quite a contrast to Jesse Jackson or any of the older civil rights leaders who always spoke about, well, black people were discriminated or are discriminated against. Think back to segregation, think back to slavery, and all of that. And people say, oh, yeah, it's kind of a grim. But here comes Obama, and he's like, no, I am proud to be an American. And this story, my story, couldn't have happened anywhere but America. And people start talking about a post-racial America. He kind of resists that. But then he gets elected because of I mean, literally, his poster said hope, new hope, you know,
Right.
Obama.
Right.
And he gets elected. He says, I'm the president of all Americans, but he's still the first black president, right? How are you going to get away from, as you said with your reporters, you could have even said he's a perfect African American. Is he the first black president? Okay. But when he gets in office, the powers of race in American society is pretty strong. And so, you know, black America has expectations. He's going to deliver for them. And then there's resistance and people say, oh, is he the black president? Is that why we're doing Obamacare? He's giving our tax dollars and our healthcare programs to those poor people, disproportionately the minority. Suddenly, he's having to be somewhat, in some eyes, the black president. But in his eyes, I think he always thought of himself as the president of the United States.
Well, we have a new president now, and he's got his work cut out for him.
Yeah.
I would say, reaching out to the people that you're talking about, the people you wrote this book about.
Yeah.
That's going to do it for us. Juan Williams, thanks for joining us. If you're listening and you like this conversation, even if you don't, run out and buy his book, New Prize for These Eyes, Second American Civil Rights Movement. Juan Williams, thanks for joining us.
Carl, what a pleasure. You surprised me. You know a lot about this topic.
Well, we'll talk about that over a beer. So don't go away. We'll be right back. You're listening to Real Clear Politics on POTUS Channel 124.